Imagine a bomber crossing the Atlantic, its crew knowing they would not return, aiming their sights at Manhattan. That image has haunted post-war rumor mills for decades. The claim that the Luftwaffe trained crews and modified bombers for a one-way strike on New York sounds like the stuff of thrillers. A single photograph, a late confession from a veteran, and a daring Arctic airfield that proves part of the logistics. My goal here is simple. Trace the pieces of evidence, run the numbers as clearly as possible, and judge how plausible this alleged Heinkel He 177 raid over Manhattan really was. If you enjoy deep dives into WW2 aviation mysteries, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what you think. Hitler and some elements of the German High Command entertained the idea of striking the United States, both for strategic disruption and for symbolic effect. The notion of bringing the war directly to American soil offered propaganda value and a way to demoralize opponents, even if the material payoff would be limited. The problem was brutally practical. The Atlantic is vast. Any bomber undertaking a transatlantic strike needed enormous range or some way to refuel and rearm far from Allied detection. Germany explored several concepts to bridge that distance: submarine-assisted missions, airborne V-weapons aimed at distant targets, and the long-discussed America bomber projects intended to build true intercontinental aircraft. None of these produced an executed attack, but fragments of planning and experimentation survived the war. Among those fragments, the Heinkel He 177 stands out because it was Germany's only heavy four-engine bomber in operational service. It was chosen as the Luftwaffe's closest approximation to a strategic bomber, but it carried a troubled reputation. The He 177 was plagued by engine fires and mechanical fragility, in large part because designers had to install coupled engines, pairing two power plants into a single nacelle, to meet a Luftwaffe requirement for dive bombing capability. Whether that requirement was reasonable or not, the result was engines prone to overheating and in-flight fires that cost aircraft and crews. Still, by late war years, some engineers and technicians were working on variants and field conversions that sought to extend range, increase fuel capacity, or adapt the airframe for special missions. This is where the A-7 and the so-called V-38 modified He 177s enter the story. Photographs taken in 1945 of at least one heavily altered He 177 have fueled speculation that some examples were being converted into long-range variants. Observers point to a wider bomb bay, revised wing sections, and external changes that could accommodate extra fuel tanks or different engine setups. It has been suggested that these modifications, sometimes lumped under the informal label A7 or the factory experimental tag V38, could have given the He 177 enough endurance for transatlantic sorties if flown one way or staged from forward refueling points. Important caveats apply. The provenance of the photographs is contested. The degree to which these airframes were flight-capable is debated, and most historians treat such sightings as suggestive rather than conclusive. Into that interpretive space steps a personal testimony that resurfaced in 2005. Peter Brill, who said he trained as a Luftwaffe navigator at age 19, published an account claiming he attended special navigation courses for a planned long-range raid. According to Brill, crews were prepared for a mission that would not allow a return flight. Navigators were drilled intensively to guide aircraft over the North Atlantic toward U.S. targets. Brill's statement captivated attention because it offers an eyewitness thread to an otherwise fragmentary record. Yet this is a classic single-source problem. His testimony adds texture and immediacy, but it does not by itself prove that an operational mission was launched, or that a fleet of modified He 177s ever crossed the Atlantic. Some elements of Brill's account, training schedules, unit names, even fragments of documentation, have partial corroboration, but many details remain unverified in the archival record. Historians therefore treat his claim as an intriguing lead rather than a closed case. To move beyond impressions, we need to talk numbers. Technical arithmetic is unforgiving. Range depends on fuel, aircraft weight, engine efficiency, wind, and payload. For the purpose of this analysis, I'll use baseline figures commonly cited in secondary sources for the He 177A5 model, and then explain how modifications could change the calculus. One set of published numbers gives a ferry range for an unloaded He 177A5 on extended fuel tanks at roughly 3,700 miles. With a combat load, say a 1,000 kilogram bomb, The same aircraft's effective combat radius or operational range could drop to something on the order of 3,300 miles. Those figures vary between sources and depend on assumptions about fuel reserve, cruising power settings, and whether auxiliary tanks are fitted. Always bear in mind that small shifts in assumptions move the outcome significantly. Now compare those ranges to geography. A direct leg from Trondheim in occupied Norway, a frequent Luftwaffe North Atlantic staging point, to Manhattan is about 3,590 miles. On paper, an unloaded He-177 with a ferry configuration might barely reach New York from Trondheim, but add bombs, radio equipment, and the need for fuel reserves for navigation errors and adverse weather, and the margin disappears. That's why most analysts rule out a simple Trondheim-New York round trip, or even a one-way direct sortie with a significant bomb load. This is where Greenland enters the equation. Consider a two-legged approach. Trondheim to a staging point on Greenland, then Greenland to New York. The distance from Trondheim to the Kapsusi area on Greenland is roughly 1,370 miles. From Greenland's eastern ice edge to New York is on the order of 2,454 miles. The idea would be to fly from northern bases in Norway to pre-positioned refueling caches or rendezvous with a U-boat or transport aircraft on the Greenland ice, top up fuel, then push on to the American coast. Under this scheme, the effective range requirement from the Greenland field to New York would be significantly less than a direct Atlantic crossing from Europe, and it becomes conceivable, again, in theory, that a heavily modified He-177 could make the second leg if it carried extra fuel and reduced bomb load. The logistical keystone for this plan rests on whether Germany could prepare and maintain a staging base in Greenland undetected. The Nazi regime kept several meteorological parties and small weather stations in remote Arctic areas, the so-called weather war. These teams were intended to provide forecasters with crucial data for U-boat operations and air movements in the North Atlantic. One episode often cited by proponents of the Greenland staging idea is the Ju-290 landing and rescue at a location sometimes referred to in the sources as Kapsusi or Basger in June 1944. The Junkers Ju-290 was a long-range transport and reconnaissance aircraft capable of operating from rough ice fields when necessary. In that documented case, a Ju-290 reportedly landed on sea ice, rescued personnel, and returned. That event demonstrated empirically that large German aircraft could, under favorable conditions, land on and depart from Arctic sea ice. It also suggests the possibility, again, not proof, that fuel and supplies might have been moved onto the ice by similar flights, or stockpiled near weather stations to support unusual missions. There are further practical proofs and limits to consider. A Ju-290 has a different performance envelope and reliability profile than a He-177. The Ju-290 had better reliability for transport roles and was not plagued by the same engine coupling problems. Using Ju-290 sorties to pre-position fuel for a He-177 is not impossible in concept, but it requires multiple coordinated flights, secure caches in an environment where shifting ice and storms could destroy supplies, and absolute secrecy. It also assumes Allied intelligence and patrols would miss these activities, an ever more difficult prospect as 1944 turned into 1945, and Allied maritime and aerial surveillance tightened. Another proposed support method was U-boat rendezvous. Submarines could, in theory, surface near predictably safer stretches of the Arctic to refuel aircraft from bladders or transfer fuel drums to ice or to a shore site. But by 1944-45, the North Atlantic was tightly contested. Allied anti-submarine warfare had improved dramatically. Convoy escort air coverage, long-range maritime patrol aircraft, radar, and code breaking had made U-boat operations increasingly perilous. Surfacing near Greenland to top up fuel or conduct large-scale coordination with aircraft would have entailed severe detection risk. A single exposed U-boat could trigger entire coordinated Allied responses, and any U-boat carrying extra aviation fuel or supplies would be a tempting target, whose loss would cripple the mission chain. There's also the human and material cost to weigh. The He-177 was not a forgiving aircraft. Crews were already at high risk even on routine missions over Europe. A one-way mission to New York implies acceptance that crews would be lost or captured. That raises ethical and command considerations. Would the Luftwaffe High Command approve an operation mostly symbolic in its damage for the near-certain sacrifice of trained crews and expensive aircraft? Some wartime correspondence and post-war recollections suggest elements in the leadership, under political pressure and spectacular desperation, discussed dramatic plans. But other documents and the pragmatic warfighting calculus point to a reluctance to waste scarce resources on gestures with minimal strategic return. Historians, therefore, tend to view such plans as possible brainstorming under duress rather than vetted, funded operations ready to go. The nature and role of the He 177 modifications deserve particular scrutiny. The aircraft photographed in May 1945 at Cheb, then part of Czechoslovakia, shows external changes that some interpret as the V-38 experimental conversion: wider wings, structural alterations around the belly, and a different nacelle arrangement. Some veterans and post-war analysts argued these changes were intended to improve range and allow heavier fuel loads. Others counter that the photographed airframe was incomplete, perhaps a prototype or post-damage rebuild, and not representative of an operational fleet. Conservative historians emphasize the photographic evidence is ambiguous. A single photographed airframe cannot substitute for operational records, mass production capabilities, or demonstrated flight performance under full-load transatlantic conditions. In short, a modified He 177 might theoretically have flown farther, but there's scant proof that enough airworthy machines existed, or that they could be made reliable, in time to matter. We should also address the nature of the target and what a raid could realistically achieve. New York, even in the 1940s, was defended by coastal radars, interception-capable fighters, and civil defense measures. A small number of bombing runs, particularly if they were one-way and the attackers carried limited payloads to maximize range, would likely have been more symbolic than strategically decisive. The aim, if the motivation was psychological or propaganda, might have been to frighten and to claim a headline. Militarily, the cost-benefit ratio looks poor. Germany would expend scarce long-range assets and experienced crews for limited physical damage and a probable propaganda response from the Allies that would harden resolve rather than fracture morale. Returning to Brill's testimony, it provides important color and a potential insider's view of special navigation training and readiness posture. Brill describes intensive plotting, dead reckoning training, and rehearsals oriented toward long overwater tracks where radio silence and blackout navigation mattered. That training is consistent with what we know about Luftwaffe navigation practices for extended maritime missions. It does not, however, bridge the gap between training and execution. Men can be trained and never deployed. Prototypes can be built and never mass-produced. Testimony must be weighed against surviving unit orders, production logs, fuel shipments, and operational records. In the case of this alleged Manhattan raid, documentary evidence of an actual operation is thin. Testimony and a photograph exist, but neither concretely demonstrates a mission was launched. Finally, consider the strategic judgment that likely prevailed in the Luftwaffe and German High Command. By late 1944 and into 1945, Germany faced acute shortages. Fuel, experienced aircrew, and production capacity were all eroding. The Allies dominated sea lanes and gradually closed the ring. Under those conditions, risking rare long-range assets in a mission that was unlikely to alter the course of the war appears implausible as a widely approved strategy. That does not mean isolated experimental plans, abortive exercises, or personal vows to strike the United States did not exist. It does mean that the leap from concept or training to executed raid over Manhattan is a very large one, and currently, the weight of documentary evidence tilts against the idea that a sustained operational program to bomb New York was actually carried out. So where does that leave us? The story is a patchwork of credible fragments and unresolved gaps. We have a bomber type that, with modifications, could in theory extend its reach. We have at least one photographed modified airframe whose status is ambiguous. We have documented Arctic operations, including Ju-290 landings on sea ice, that indicate the Germans could manage unusual logistical feats. And we have a veteran's testimony describing navigation training for a long-range strike. But we also have the harsh arithmetic of range versus payload, the logistical vulnerability of U-boat and ice staging schemes in an environment increasingly monitored by Allied forces, and the strategic logic that makes sacrificing crews and expensive aircraft for a largely symbolic blow an unlikely priority for commanders fighting for survival. In short, elements of the plan, modifications, staging ideas, and training existed in fragmentary form and made a theoretical one-way strike possible on paper. Yet the combination of technical limits, operational risk, and strategic impracticality makes it unlikely that a full-scale executed Luftwaffe bombing of Manhattan took place. The claim lives in the borderland between what's been suggested and what's been proven. It's an important historical question precisely because it forces us to examine how wartime desperation breeds wild experiments, and how testimony, photographs, and a single successful Arctic landing can be woven into a narrative that looks convincing at a glance, but frays under careful critical scrutiny. If this investigation piqued your interest, I've listed primary and secondary sources in the description: photographs of the modified He 177, archives on Luftwaffe A-series variants, accounts of the Ju-290 Greenland missions, and Peter Brill's 2005 statements. I'd love to hear what evidence you find most compelling, or where you think the case still needs proof. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe, share the video with someone who loves military aviation history, and check the description for links to sources and ways to support further research and episodes.